Story: Baseball in Heaven. Two old men, Abe and Saul, sit on a park bench feeding pigeons and talking about baseball. Abe turns to Saul and asks, "Do you think there's baseball in heaven?" Saul thinks about it for a minute and replies, "I dunno, but let's make a deal. If I die first, I'll come back and tell you if there's baseball in heaven, and if you die first, you do the same." They shake on it, and sadly, a few months later, poor Abe passes on. Soon afterward, Saul sits in the park feeding the pigeons by himself and hears a voice whisper, "Saul! Saul!" Saul responds, "Abe, is that you?" "Yes, it is, Saul," whispers Abe's ghost. Saul, still amazed, asks, "So, is there baseball in heaven?" "Well," says Abe, "I've got good news and bad news." "Gimme the good news first," says Saul. Abe says, "Well, there is baseball in heaven." Saul says, "That's great. What news could be bad enough to ruin that?" Abe sighs and whispers, "You're pitching on Friday." Story: For Little Animals. A teacher asked her class, "What do you want out of life?" A little girl in the back row raised her hand and said, "All I want out of life is for little animals, just like my mom always says." The teacher asked, "Really, and what for little animals would that be?" The little girl said, "A mink on my back, a jaguar in the garage, a tiger in the bed, and a jackass to pay for all of it." The teacher got a coughing fit and had to leave the room. Story: The Tickle Me Elmo Toys. There is a factory in northern Minnesota which makes the Tickle Me Elmo toys. The toy laughs when you tickle it under the arms. Well, Lena is hired at the Tickle Me Elmo factory, and she reports for her first day promptly at 8 a.m. The next day at 8:45 there is a knock at the personnel manager's door. The foreman throws open the door and begins to rant about the new employee. He complains that she is incredibly slow and the whole line is backing up, putting the entire production line behind schedule. The personnel manager decides he should see this for himself. So the two men march down to the factory floor. When they get there, the line is so backed up that there are Tickle Me Elmos all over the factory floor, and they're really beginning to pile up. At the end of the line stands Lena, surrounded by mountains of Tickle Me Elmos. She has a roll of plush red fabric and a huge bag of small marbles. The two men watch in amazement as she cuts a little piece of fabric, wraps it around to marbles, and begin to carefully sew the little package between Elmo's legs. The personnel manager bursts into laughter. After several minutes of hysterics, he pulls himself together and approaches Lena. "I'm sorry," he says to her, barely able to keep a straight face, "but I think you misunderstood the instructions I gave you yesterday. Your job is to give Elmo to test tickles." Story: Lawyer and $2 million Money. When the CEO of a company gets arrested for embezzlement, he makes a frantic phone call to his lawyer. The lawyer meets him in the police station. "Listen," the CEO says, "I've got at least $2 million stashed in a Cayman's account. Can you get me out of this?" "Believe me," the lawyer says, "there is no way you're going to prison with that kind of money." True to his word, the lawyer made sure that 10 months later, the CEO went to prison flat broke. Story: Two Men on an Island. Two men were marooned on an island. One man paced back and forth, worried and scared, while the other man sat back and was sunning himself. The first man said to the second man, "Aren't you afraid we are about to die?" "No," said the second man, "for you see I make $100,000 per week, and I tithe faithfully to my church every week. My pastor will find me." Story: Lucky Lawyer. Two law partners, Ed and Joe, are driving through the country one evening during a vacation when their car breaks down near a farmhouse. The two men head over to the house and knock on the door. An attractive lady dressed in black opens the door and asks, "Can I help you?" Ed says, listen, our car broke down near here and it's getting late and, well, we were wondering if you could put us up for the night. The lady shook her head. I don't think so. You see, I'm recently a widow and it just wouldn't seem proper. What would my neighbors say? Look, says Joe, we won't cause you any trouble. We could sleep in your barn. The lady agrees and the two men spend the night in her barn. 9 months later, Ed gets a letter at their firm from another lawyer. He reads the letter, then goes immediately into Joe's office next door. Joe, do you remember that widow we met 9 months ago? Yeah. I've got a letter here from her attorney, just out of curiosity. That night we slept in the barn. Did you get up in the middle of the night and make a little visit to the farmhouse? Yeah, says Joe, turning a little red. You didn't happen to get a little intimate with the widow, did you? Well, yes. And did you use my name by chance? Joe blushes beet red and says, yeah, Ed, I did. Ed smiles. Cool. She died last month and left me the farm. Story, same place as before. 2 hunters from Moscow charter a small plane to fly them to Siberia to go bear hunting. On landing, the pilot says, remember, this plane can only fly with 2 hunters, 1 pilot, and 1 bear. The hunters go out and return with 2 bears. So the pilot says, I told you 1 bear. But the hunters point out that the previous year, on payment of an extra 100 rubles, the pilot had let them put 2 bears on board. After long discussions centering on the impossibility of the thing and the disgraceful degree of inflation, the pilot takes 200 rubles and with much pushing and shoving the hunters get aboard with the 2 bears. After struggling into the air and fitfully flying for about 2 hours, the plane gives up and plummets to the earth in a snowbank. Climbing out from under the snow and the bears, the hunters ask the pilot where he thinks they are. The pilot says, about the same place where we crashed last year. Story, Tom and Jack. Tom and Jack, 2 government maintenance guys, were standing at the base of a flagpole, looking up. A woman walked by and asked what they were doing. We're supposed to find the height of the flagpole, said Bob, but we don't have a ladder. The woman said, hand me that wrench out of your toolbox. She loosened a few bolts, then laid the pole down. She then took a tape measure from their toolbox, took a measurement and announced 18 feet, 6 inches and walked away. Tom shook his head and laughed. Well, ain't that just like a miss-know-it-all woman, he said. We need the height and she gives us the length. Tom and Jack are still working for the government. Story, in the middle of a cornfield. A blonde is driving in her Mini down the highway when she notices another blonde in a boat out in the middle of a cornfield. The blonde in the boat was rowing the boat. The blonde was very frustrated at how stupid the blonde in the car was being, so she pulled over and got out of the car. She yelled across the road, "Hey, you in the boat, I'm talking to you." The blonde in the boat turned and waved and continued rowing the boat. The blonde across the street yelled out again, "I tease blondes like you that give you a bad name and I'd come hit you if I could swim." Story, to slow or stop. A guy goes through a stop sign in Chester and gets caught by a policeman. Cop says, "License and registration, please." Guy says, "What for?" Cop says, "You didn't come to a complete stop at the stop sign." Guy says, "I slowed down and no one was coming." Cop says, "You still didn't come to a complete stop. License and registration, please." Guy says, "What's the difference?" Cop says, "The difference is you have to come to a complete stop. License and registration, please." Guy says, "If you can show me the difference between slow down and stop, I'll give you my license and registration." Cop says, "Okay, exit your vehicle, sir." At this point, the cop takes out his truncheon and starts beating the guy and says, "Now, sir, do you want me to slow down or stop?"